Good evening. Thank you, members and friends, for attending our first ever and hopefully only virtual annual meeting. On March 4th, 2021, Fort Ligonier lost someone special to our organization, and I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about Mr. Brad Mooney and his many titles at the fort. Brad was known widely as an expert in repair and reconstruction of 18th century structures, so the title of restorator was very fitting. It was so appropriate, it was even on the license plate of his pickup truck. However, the title I heard Brad use the most when referring to himself was contractor. Every school tour Brad gave began the same way. In his loud and booming voice, he would say, "My name is Mr. Mooney. I'm a contractor, not a tour guide. I build things. I build cannons and wagons. I build forts." While Brad didn't claim the title of tour guide, he was one of Fort Ligonier's most beloved guides. School groups raved about him. Adult groups hung on his every word, and he was frequently requested as a guide. Which leads to his next title, teacher. He wasn't a teacher in the traditional sense, but he taught, and he taught well. He was an expert in edutaining, as he would call it, educating and entertaining visitors young and old. He made our history come to life through his teaching. He was a builder. As he always said in his introduction, "My name is Mr. Mooney. I'm a contractor, not a tour guide. I build things. I build cannons and wagons. I build forts." Yes, he built the fort. Yes, he built the accurate replicas of 18th century cannons and wagons that draw visitors from all around the world. Yes, he built the fort's historical buildings that bring our story to life. He also built objects to enhance our educational programs whenever I asked. Brad made a miniature tumbrel cart, a beautiful trestle table, and an oversized version of an 18th century game. He could build anything. He was also an avid researcher, devoted historian, and lifelong learner, all of which made him a renowned restorator. I want to leave you with some more of Brad's own words, things he often said to or around our staff. Number one, the fort should always look like it did in 1758. Number two, if it's wood, it will rot. Number three, Mabel, let's go to work. And number four, the most important, and don't you forget, that's my fort. A memorial service for Brad will be held at Fort Ligonier on Saturday, May 22nd at 11 a.m. We hope that you can join us. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening's program. R. Scott Stephenson, PhD, President and CEO of the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Dr. Stephenson, a Pittsburgh native, began visiting the fort when he was a young boy, attending church camp at the Presbyterian camp, now known as Ligonier Camp and Conference Center. From 2007 to 2018, Stephenson led the development of the museum's award-winning exhibitions, multimedia experiences, and educational programming, as well as overseeing the care and expansion of its collection of art and artifacts. In November 2018, Stephenson was named president and CEO. Dr. Stephenson will lead us through the museum's collection that includes objects from the Revolutionary War, including some of George Washington's personal belongings. I hope you will enjoy this spectacular opportunity and that it will inspire you to personally visit the Museum of the American Revolution. Over to you, Dr. Stephenson.
Thank you, Mary. I can't tell you how excited I am to be with you all tonight. As you mentioned in the intro, I am a Western Pennsylvanian, grew up in Pittsburgh. One of my mother's sorority sisters was a Ligonier native, so I can't even remember a time in my life when Ligonier was not part of my my existence. And the seasonal round of visiting Ligonier in the summer, of course, for camp and making sure that we hit the gay 90s, now departed Dairy Queen that was something we looked forward to, of course, as part of our summer visits, and then always coming up for Fort Ligonier days. I've eaten more pancakes at Ruthie's than beyond counting. So Ligonier holds a really dear place to me. It's also a place where I really trace back my professional development, my decision to go to graduate school and study the French and Indian War as part of my PhD, and ultimately get into museums when I was in college. I'm a Juniata College graduate. Your longtime director, Martin West, was a real mentor for me, and I spent an ungodly amount of time taking up his time, I realize now, but asking probing questions about getting into the museum field. So this is a real homecoming for me, and it's lovely. I can see many of the names of those of you who are signed in this evening, some of whom I've known for decades now, a few from Philadelphia. I'm very excited that my good friend Dean Melissa, AKA George Washington, has joined your board. So anyway, I'm really eager to share a little bit of the Museum of the American Revolution. I hope those of you who have not visited will, as we hopefully have a brighter summer ahead, will consider coming down here to Philadelphia. For those of you who have been here before, I hope this little virtual tour will resonate. And actually, Ron mentioned earlier, I think in his remarks, digitization and this sort of outreach. And I will say that I'm able to take you on a tour of the museum because of some real visionary investment by one of our supporters at the museum, who back in 2019 pushed us to do 360-degree photography and to create a virtual museum experience, which we launched in October of 2019 with not, frankly, very much fanfare. But when COVID hit last almost exactly a year ago, when we shut down in mid-March, we were able to very quickly pivot and start offering, for instance, virtual field trips for schools that are facilitated. It was a way to keep our educators engaged, and most importantly, raise our profile around the nation. So now fourth graders in Georgia, high school students out in the Midwest and on the West Coast are being sort of introduced to the story of the American Revolution, the founding era, to the museum itself through this wonderful digital tool. So this is a little bit of showing off this evening of this great tool. And you're also getting a sense of how many of these virtual audiences are experiencing the museum. I've actually given a tour for up to 3,800 people at one time just in the last couple of months. So I'm actually working with someone who you don't see on screen. That's my compatriot Meg Bowersox, who's one of our educators who runs the floor here at the museum. We call them Visitor Engagement Associates, and Meg's actually running the technology. And I wanted her to start on the landing page of the museum, because this is a resource that all of you can access at any time right through our amrevmuseum.org site. So Meg's just gonna show you with her cursor, clicking in to learn and explore, and then starting museum tour. If you're a fan of Michael Douglas, he gives us a little shout out there, and there's a wonderful introduction to the experience, and then you'll have a chance scrolling down to just start your tour. And clicking in. And so, couple of points about the story that we tell at the Museum of the American Revolution. One of our big missions is to get people to think about the American Revolution, the Revolutionary War, and the Revolutionary Era as intricately related but separate concepts. The Revolutionary Era, and this is sort of the chronological period that we cover, is about 1760, the end of the French and Indian War, and you'll see some familiar images here shortly, all the way to the early Republic, let's say 1790 or the election of 1800. We call this the Revolutionary Era. The Revolutionary War, of course, is just the conflict that established American independence. But the American Revolution is that ongoing, continuing experiment in liberty, equality, and self-government that started in that revolutionary era and continues to the present day. And so I just want to start with those concepts as we go into this, because you'll see where we land at the end, that it's very important for us to have our visitors come out of this not just sort of reflecting on a quaint tale that was happened long ago, but that also they have a kind of sense of civic engagement and a call to action at the end of their visit to our core exhibition. I also want to point out that we've organized our gallery experience around 4 questions that kind of frame roughly a quarter of the galleries each. So how did people become revolutionaries? And that's going to be this first part of our tour that really starts back in the era of the French and Indian War, when people like George Washington, of course, were very committed British patriots, felt they were part of the greatest empire since the Roman Empire. Then we go and we ask, how did the revolution survive its darkest hour? So having gone from being British colonists and proud of their connection to tearing down the statue of King George and declaring independence, how is it that this audacious attempt to defy Britain actually led to the creation of a new nation? Then we ask, how revolutionary was the war? So we're going to get into those mid-year points, where mid-war points, where we'll start to explore, well, did this apply to everyone? What was the experience of women, for instance, of loyalists, of enslaved people, of African descent? And then finally, the last question is, what kind of nation did the revolution create? And that will be our final exit from the galleries. So you're seeing right now a 360 view. This is a short introductory film, very immersive. It's less than a minute long, and we've placed you in the center of the place where many of you would be familiar down on, if you've ever been down to Wall Street and seen the statue of the bull on Wall Street, that statue stands just beyond where you can see on the backside of the statue of King George III. This was known as the Bowling Green, and that is a space that still exists down at the lower tip of Manhattan, and it goes back to the Dutch period of New Netherland. But in 1776, there was an enormous equestrian statue of King George III. It was gilt lead. It stood on an 18-foot high marble pedestal and was surrounded by an iron fence, which was erected in 1770 to create this very distinguished space and to protect this statue of the king. So we dramatized the moment in 1776 on July 9th, when the Declaration of Independence was first read to the army and to the inhabitants of New York, and led to a very dramatic moment where a group of soldiers and sailors tore down that statue of King George, broke it into pieces, hauled it off, most of those pieces off to Connecticut, where they were melted down into musket balls called Melted Majesty and issued out as ammunition to the Continental Army. Now we're going to come back to that moment a little bit later on our tour, but I wanted to sort of set that scene. So if you're visiting the museum, you're going to actually see a film that surrounds you, that we shot on green screen and then digitally recreated what it would have looked like looking up Wall Street there had you been in New York on July 9th, 1776. And Meg, let's scroll into the next gallery. So that sort of sets the scene that maybe 1776 isn't just about George Washington in a tent, or about Thomas Jefferson and John Adams writing important words for the Declaration of Independence. That this is a story that's going to be messy, that's going to involve violence, that's going to range over a great distance. But when we step through the glass doors into this first gallery, which we call Rule Britannia, you're stepping back 15 years then. You're at the sort of midpoint of the 7 Years' War. We have a new king, King George III. You'll see as we scroll the window, I hope you'll all, scroll in this browser window, you'll recognize the fellow standing there. And that is in fact a reproduced image of a painting very familiar to you all at Fort Ligonier. Erica Knuckles was very kind to help us get an image from Fort Ligonier's collection. Now, we didn't want to just do a sort of a fake version of a fabulous painting that hangs at Fort Ligonier. And we were also interested in making sure that our very immersive galleries, which have a lot of tactile, touchable elements, and are accessible for people, for instance, who are either sightless or have reduced vision, that they would have opportunities to interact with our gallery. So what you're actually seeing is a three-dimensional print from that painting that you can actually touch and describe to people who are maybe not able to see it the way we're seeing it. So there's a little bit of Fort Ligonier right in the first gallery of the museum. But if we keep panning around to the left here, the main attraction of this first gallery is an incredible group of objects that we pulled together that document the place of the king and royal imagery in the lives of people from all different walks of life in colonial America. You know, we wanted people to understand that this is a moment in which, for many people, being part of the British Empire, even though you were colonists living here in North America. This was a great, proud moment, and none more proud than people like young George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and others were very, very committed British imperialists at this point. So the objects you're seeing all have imagery. On the left-hand side, royal imagery. You're seeing a tavern sign hanging in the upper left. It's hard to make out from this image, but that is the royal coat of arms that hung in front of a tavern in Connecticut. The two sort of dark framed coats of arms, the one in the lower left also from Connecticut, and the one sort of centered there over the iron fireback. And I don't know, maybe we can click in and see that a little closer, Meg. That is a remarkable coat of arms. So this is painted on panel. It was found in the attic of Independence Hall in 1844 and preserved as a relic. If you notice at the top, it has the initials AR for Anne Rex. So this dates back to the reign of Queen Anne, so before George I. We believe that it actually originally hung in the courthouse, which is up on Market Street here in Philadelphia, just a block north of where I'm sitting here at the museum. And of course was taken down and replaced by King George I, and later second and third, and just sort of tucked away and moved around and discovered. But it's a reminder that even in your home and the drinking vessels that you'll see displayed here, and the fireback that might be in your hearth, that you are constantly reminded that you were part of an empire with a monarch at its head. Now, on the right side of the case, we also try to sort of reinforce this point about the aspirations of colonial Americans, many of whom we would later come to think of as revolutionaries. So the tavern sign hanging in the upper right corner with General James Wolfe, a good French and Indian War British general. This is, of course, based on a very famous print and painting celebrating the victory at Quebec in 1759. This is actually a tavern sign from Connecticut that belonged to a provincial soldier at the time, an officer named Israel Putnam, who would eventually, of course, become an American Revolutionary general, famous, of course, for fighting at the Battle of Bunker Hill, may have been the one who uttered, "Do not fire till you see the whites of their eyes." And it's a great reminder, again, that in their younger lives, being part of the British Empire, being connected to these great victories of the 7 Years' War, a story so well told at Fort Ligonier, this was how they came up and matured on the eve of what we would later, in retrospect, see was the march toward revolution. So let's zoom out of that, Meg, and we'll go to the next gallery here. You'll recognize that guy up there, George Washington. So this is a gallery where we both advance the story that we're telling, but we're also introducing new display techniques. So the previous gallery that we looked at, sort of a traditional object-rich static display. One of the things we do in this first series of galleries is introduce our visitors to different types of exhibit techniques and different ways of engaging with the story that we will then use throughout the rest of the museum. We have 16,000 square feet of core exhibition space, roughly 16 galleries, and we're in the second one right here. So you can see it's a long journey. So what we do here is we're trying to tell the story of the background to the Stamp Act. You know, King George and Parliament did not just wake up one day and decide it's time to oppress the Americans. What was the background of that attempt to raise revenue from the colonists in North America that ultimately, surprising to even people like Benjamin Franklin, led to such virulent colonial resistance and ultimately led to the outbreak of war a decade later? Well, that's the story that we tell here. So the objects in the cases are keyed to a film that you see where George Washington's face is. And when you come into the gallery, there's a dynamic several-minute presentation that looks at what the British are trying to accomplish after the French and Indian War, which was to prevent war from breaking out again, to control territory. The role that places like Fort Ligonier and Fort Pitt and Detroit and Fort Deschartres play in trying to create a settled, controlled, vastly expanded empire in North America. And of course, the funds that need to be raised to pay for those troops. We also look at this from the perspective of Native people. So actually in the center, many of you will recognize that long wampum belt that actually has a great local Ligonier connection. Many of you will remember the PBS series, The War That Made America, produced by WQED for the 250th. I spent every single day of shooting up at the Rolling Rock Club where we did the filming, and a good friend of mine, Dwayne Schreckengoss from Western Pennsylvania, actually wove all the beads. I think there's something like 40,000 wampum beads that are in this belt, and it's a recreation of a wampum belt presented to the Iroquois Confederacy at Albany in 1754. So we use these objects to sort of explore what's the perspective of Native people in this period where they have pledged their support to the British, allowing them to drive the French out of places like Fort Duquesne during the French and Indian War, but with promises that their lands will be reserved, will be protected from the encroachment of settlers. And then finally, we tell the story of what's the perspective of people like George Washington, who have gone into this conflict with the French, thinking that the spoils of war, of course, will be access to those very same lands. And so this gallery uses detailed images of those objects and incorporates them into the film as a way to train our visitors to look closely at those objects. You know, sometimes exhibit designers use, I think, used objects just as kind of wallpaper, and they don't help the visitors really look and understand the power of being in the presence of real, authentic witnesses to the stories that we tell. So we sort of leave you at a hanging moment here, which is the Stamp Act has been passed, colonial protests erupt, and then what's going to happen next. And so Meg's going to fly us into our next gallery, and you'll see it's sort of presided over by this very dramatic recreation of a Liberty tree. Of course, Boston's Liberty tree was an ancient elm that was used as a gathering place for the sons and daughters of liberty, a kind of open air place to discuss measures to try to coordinate resistance to these British taxes and acts during that decade from 1765 to 1775. And so here, again, we're advancing the story chronologically and thematically, but we've also introduced the exhibit tool of immersion. So now you feel like we're evoking you being in one of these spaces. The floor is actually textured and tinted concrete, but it's got animal tracks and footprints and cart tracks going through it. We've got handmade lanterns hanging from the branches above, and actually a piece of the last surviving Liberty tree, which stood in Annapolis, Maryland until 1999, that was donated to us. That's actually embedded in the other side of the trunk from what you see right now. That's a touchable element. And then along one side of the gallery, and you see in the background the touch screens there, is a sort of chronological treatment, both in a traditional timeline as well as a touchscreen interactive, to explore some of the major events that take you from the Stamp Act through the Townsend Acts, through the Coercive Acts, and how did this kind of relentless march toward armed confrontation happen during that decade. And then on the right side, through much of the rest of the gallery, we're exploring kind of thematically what were the different kinds of resistance that took place. There was, of course, nonviolent economic boycotts. And actually, I want you to, if you can pan around to the shop shelves there, Meg, we'll talk a little bit about what we do with non-importation. You can see symbols like Liberty caps and Liberty poles. And then these shelves here are showing the impact of non-importation agreements. So just as people around the world tried to confront apartheid in the 1980s by doing economic boycotts, this was a technique that goes all the way back, of course, to the 18th century, and colonial Americans voluntarily agreeing not to import many British goods to try to put pressure on Parliament to overturn things like the Stamp Act. The little handles you see underneath those shelves, you lift those up to discover objects that are displayed from the period. In this case, side-by-side examples. On the left, an imported piece of printed fabric that would have come from Britain. And on the right, that's actually an incredibly rare piece of printed linen that was printed here in Philadelphia using that block printing technique. So we want to introduce our visitors to those different techniques that our predecessors in the 18th century used to try to affect public policy. In the corner case, in this case, we've got some wonderful ceramics that in most cases are imported ceramics, but were produced with patriotic slogans. For instance, "Liberty Forever." Can we see the Boston mug? That's one of our favorites in the collection here. There's of course the Chinese porcelain, but yes, this wonderful English creamware mug, "Success to the City of Boston, Liberty Forever," is a great example. Just as much of the political paraphernalia that we wear during our presidential campaigns often comes from overseas. The same was the case in the 18th century, where here's an English potter who's writing a slogan that is being taken to heart by American patriots here, in this case in Boston in the 18th century. So let's roll on, Meg. I want to keep us rolling. Maybe we'll go to Phyllis Wheatley. I want to point out another technique we use throughout the museum. There's a couple of moments. This is one where the story that we're telling is sort of very elevated, where we're talking about evolving concepts of liberty and freedom. And we always want to pause there to remind our viewers and explore that this didn't apply to everyone at the time. And certainly that's the case here in the decade leading up to the Revolutionary War. Phyllis Wheatley, of course, was actually captured as a child during the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, by a British expedition to the west coast of Africa. She was enslaved and lived with the Wheatley family near Boston in Massachusetts. Was very bright, was educated, was taught to read and write. And one of the great treasures in the museum's collection is an original signed copy of her poems, published in London in 1773, where she traveled with support from prominent members of the Sons of Liberty and other patriotic Americans in Boston, and who contributed to the cost of getting her poems published. Now, on one of the pages here, do we have an image of the signature? Yeah, there it is. It's reproduced above, but it's actually on the flyleaf of the volume. This is her actual signature, and it has such incredible, powerful effect on our visitors, particularly our young visitors, to think this is not only a poem book published, the first published African-American poet, but she actually held it in her hands and signed it. And usually we try to make sure that signature, we have to rotate, of course, for conservation reasons, but several times a year we try to make sure that visitors actually see the original signature. So shall we zoom back out? Let's get the firing started here, because I know I could spend 7 hours talking about everything in the galleries here. So at this point, you've had about a decade of controversy across the Atlantic. The colonists sort of starting to create an imagined community. People from Massachusetts and Pennsylvania and Virginia, probably for the first time, starting to feel some kinship and connection. Although, of course, the Virginians and the Pennsylvanians, there was that sore point of which colony Pittsburgh existed in at the time. But generally speaking, that's the trajectory of this time. But finally, the powder keg explodes on April 19th, 1775. And that's the moment that we talk about in this next gallery here. It's a small circular gallery that really focuses on the shot heard around the world, the fighting at Concord Bridge, which happened later in the morning after the first confrontation on Lexington Green. What's remarkable about our displays here is all of the objects on display were either witness objects that were actually there during the fight, or in a few cases, portraits or objects that belonged to people who were actually there in the confrontation at Concord. We've taken the famous engraving by Amos Doolittle that's kind of a folk arty image, but was informed by eyewitness testimony and published within a couple months of the fighting on April 19th of 1775. And you can see the bridge arching the stream there. in the background. And then the beam that's in front displayed is actually an original piece of the Old North Bridge. The diagonal cut there, and were Brad Mooney with us tonight, I know he'd be fascinated to see this this mortise and this remnants of the mortise and tenon connection. This is one of the diagonal braces there. Meg's zooming in so you can see those diagonal braces that held the bridge up. And that's a timber that actually the bridge was fell apart and sort of fell down into the river, and the road moved to a different location. So it wasn't until the 1950s, during some work there at the location, that this old timber was brought up out of the mud in the river there in Concord. And so it's just one of those witness objects that just absolutely gives you chills when you're in its presence. And there's a million stories about these other items as well, but I want to keep us moving. So we'll go into our next gallery. Here's our friend George Washington makes his new appearance. Of course, we met him during the French and Indian War as a young, aspiring British officer. As we all know here, because we're all history buffs, history takes a slightly different turn for him. And this is a gallery where we set up a problem. Again, we're still in that first question of how people become revolutionaries. So we've gone back, we've started to take them through what were some of the issues that were dividing the British colonists from the people at home during that decade. Now it's 1775, and those colonists have been thinking of one another sort of as maybe having this American identity. But it's an important point to make that this nation did not emerge whole like from the head of Zeus as soon as the firing started, and certainly was not complete before the Revolutionary War began, despite what John Adams would later say. So this gallery really tries to crystallize the problem faced by George Washington, by all of us as Americans, and that is, how do you unify a people who had been previously the glue that had held them together was a very distant king who was not a very intrusive presence in their lives. And so this gallery, the dramatic moment that you see, at first it's a little confusing, and we ask our school kids, like, what's going on here? And they see the boy in the red coat, so they think, well, maybe that's the British who are fighting Americans. But this is actually a scene from the pension deposition of a Massachusetts man, an elderly man in the 19th century in 1842, but who was that young boy in 1775 in that winter who had come out with his father as a kind of server or companion, and witnessed a fight that broke out between Virginia riflemen, and those are the two gentlemen in hunting shirts on the right, and his fellow Massachusetts Marblehead fishermen who were dressed in their seamen's clothing. They were a mixed race unit, so you see an African-American soldier there besting a rifleman on the ground, and with George Washington placed in the center, breaking up this fight. Now, this is all based on this recollection of this young boy, Israel Trask, who witnessed this moment of sort of two parts of, it's almost presciently imagining the fight that will happen almost a century later in the 1860s, which often our school kids pick up on. But the challenge that George Washington has in trying to unify these people and to see themselves as Americans. And that's a storyline that, of course, will continue through the whole time that we explore in the museum. And then the cases around the tableau explore these different regional cultures. So on the left, objects that reflect New England's military traditions. Now, those include on a pedestal a Bible that was carried by a New England soldier at the Battle of Bunker Hill. There's engraved powder horns, many of the types of things that, of course, you're familiar with at Fort Ligonier, but that really focus on these New England soldiers. On the right, objects that reflect the Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia riflemen. And then from the perspective we're looking, I don't know if we can zoom around, you'll see George Washington himself. And we've got a wartime portrait, a copy of Charles Wilson Peel's portrait of Washington that he sat for here in Philadelphia in the spring of 1776. And the only sword of Washington still in private hands that's on display on loan to us from a collector. So we got objects that sort of anchor that story as well. Let's go ahead and zoom ahead Lots about Henry Knox and Fort Ticonderoga and the cannons as well. But I want to march us along to the gallery we call Revolution. And so this is where getting to the point where we would ask you as our visitors, school kids, those who are doing a virtual tour, to answer that question of, well, how did we get to this point where that statue of King George III is going to be torn down? How did people become revolutionaries? And so you'll see a case here that we got funding from Richard Gilder. The late Richard Gilder recently passed away from the Gilder-Lehrman Institute, to rotate documents from the Gilder-Lehrman collection that sort of look at this question of should the colonies declare independence from the perspective of revolutionaries, of loyalists. How did the king go from being a really positive, exciting person that you venerated to somebody that needed to be torn down and called a tyrant? What's the perspective of the people between Native Americans? And it just to the left here, you'll see touchscreen interactives. We kind of went light with electronics in the museum, but there's some key spaces where we really felt like interactive technology was the best way to tell our story. And so here you see, these are 3 screens. They're all a way to access what we call Seasons of Independence. And this is an interactive that we're actually bringing online, so it'll be available for schools and interested people in the next couple of months, that explores all the ways that different communities moved towards supporting the Declaration of Independence in the 6 months leading up to July 4th of 1776. So let's go around, Meg, and just look at where the Declaration appears. This is a gallery where we always will have a period printing of the Declaration of Independence. Of course, we've all been to the National Archives. We've seen the engrossed copy of the Declaration there. But, you know, not many people actually saw that document in this period. That wasn't the way colonial Americans encountered those powerful words of the Declaration. It was through these printed broadsides and newspapers that story, that document was spread. And so every couple of months we will rotate a new printing. We actually, for the first 8 months that we were open, Gettysburg College loaned us one of only 2 surviving German language printed in Philadelphia copies of the Declaration. It was absolutely electrifying to see. But any given time, you might see a John Dunlap broadside, you might see a first newspaper printing of the Declaration from the Philadelphia Evening Post. So there's always reasons to come back. I want to sort of scroll to the right here quickly also to come back to a similar moment like we talked about with Phyllis Wheatley, and that is, while we're talking about these lofty ideals of our Charter of Freedom, the Declaration of Independence, we also want to always explore with our visitors, who does this apply to? What is the relationship of this expansion of freedom, these ideas about liberty, about self-government, to women, to people of African descent who are enslaved or free, to laboring men who are often forgotten as people who did not enjoy many political rights in the colonial era, but who were the first sort of beneficiaries of the expansion of suffrage and political opportunities in this revolutionary era. Now we're going to take a peek now right at the statue. We've now brought you back to that moment where you started. And so for our school groups, we'll gather them right on this spot. They'll look up and they are now sort of in the moment that they've started their journey. And this is a fabulous 3-dimensional life cast figure representing one of those sailors, American sailors, who climbed up, put a rope around the neck of King George, and he's inviting you to catch this rope that he's about to throw down to you. And this is when we ask our students, like, what would you do in this moment? They learn about what happened. So in the case below the statue, you see several fragments, original surviving fragments. These are on a long-term loan to us from the New York Historical Society. So those are on the left of the case. Those kind of amorphous lumps are actually original pieces of that gilt lead that created the statue. There they are. You can still see traces of the gilding there, and where the tool marks where they've been hacked apart with sledgehammers and pickaxes. And then can you show us the ball there, the melted majesty? So this is a remarkable object. And archaeologist of our acquaintance who was doing some work out at the site of the Battle of Monmouth in New Jersey. So fast forward 2 years to the summer of 1778. Was surveying a site that was going to be destroyed for a housing project. And so they were doing a metal detector survey, carefully recording the location of these finds. And they found several of these musket balls that were lead, but they had a different sort of patina. The corrosion was different than what you would expect. What that's signaling is that it's a different alloy. And just on a hunch, knowing the story that that statue had been broken apart, it had been melted down, it had been 42,000 musket balls rolled into cartridges and issued back out. He was like, I wonder if. And so with a non-destructive chemical testing and XRF technology, the chemical signature of this ball that you're seeing here perfectly matches those fragments of the statue. And so talk about a needle in a haystack, but that appears to be an original piece of that melted majesty fired back at the British Army, probably by Connecticut troops at the Battle of Monmouth. Now, there's a great irony, and here's how you can tell that the curator of this museum was a Pittsburgh guy, because I had to get the French and Indian War here as many times as possible. And so now we're looking on the back side of that of the statue. You can see the legs of the horse above, and I just want to point out this panel here because the day, July 9th of 1776, when that declaration was read in New York, when the troops tore down that statue, George Washington was actually reflecting on the Battle of the Monongahela, because of course this was the anniversary of the Braddock's defeat. And so he writes just a couple weeks later on July 20th, this is a quote from a letter that he writes to Adam Stephen, his old French and Indian War companion who had been at Fort Necessity with him, fought through all of his years, had been at Fort Ligonier, and now, of course, was an American general in the summer of 1776. The fleet is approaching, the British fleet, tens of thousands of soldiers and sailors and hundreds of ships are gathering to attack New York. And it seemed like the game was pretty much up. And in this letter, which some of you may know, and it's just an absolutely fabulous reflection, Washington writes to Stephen, he says, I did not let the anniversaries of the 3rd or the 9th. So in other words, the 3rd of July, meaning Fort Necessity, or the 9th, meaning the following year, Braddock's defeat, pass without remembering the grace of Providence of saving them, and feeling that even though they were facing an even greater, unimaginable challenge ahead, that Providence had saved them for some higher purpose. And so thinking, gives me chills to think that that's, as that scene you see in the background as those British ships are gathering off of New York Harbor, that Washington is remembering those youthful exploits in our backyard there in Western Pennsylvania is a great moment. And so I wanted to make sure that we represented that story here that's so significant to those of us from the Pittsburgh area. So you want to look at the flags real quick? I just want to point out, you will always see original Revolutionary War flags. This is a great pair of flags on the left, a color that confused people for many, many years, actually centuries, in fact, because it has a British Union up in the canton of the flag. And so most of us would see that and assume it was a British flag. But it's a great reminder that for the first year of the Revolutionary War, from 1775 to 1776, colonists were fighting to restore their rights as British subjects. And so many of those flags carried that union. And you don't have to go any farther than Bedford, Pennsylvania to see another incredible example of one of these early Revolutionary War associator flags. May well have been made by the same shop that made this flag, because the red cross that you see of St. George in the canton of the flag is a figured damask pattern that is very similar to the flag that hangs at the Fort Bedford Museum, just over the mountain from where many of you are watching. And if you haven't seen that in person, you should definitely take a ride over the mountain to see that. And then on the right, this red flag started life the same way. And then after 1776 was kind of taken apart, and the white silk stripes were re-sewn. There are 6 on one side and 7 on the other, representing the 13 now United States. But you can kind of make out the slight difference in the red fabric there to see where there once was a British Union. So just a great example of the amazing objects that you see on display in the museum. Now here we ask that second question then, which is how did the revolution survive its darkest hour? And we're gonna kind of move through these galleries kind of quick to keep you all whatever dinner reservations you have. But what you'll encounter here in the museum is a wonderful dramatic journey through the campaigns of 1776. And if you've read David McCullough's book of the same title, you'll know the fighting around New York that leads to Washington's retreat across the Jerseys, the turnaround with the Washington's crossing, and the 10 crucial days of the battles of Trenton and Princeton. And that's kind of the journey that you'll go on as you go along here. So you're introduced to the different combatants, the British Army, the figures you see, these life cast figures are representing individuals who left us written descriptions or memoirs. So they're all based on real people. In this case, the young teenage boy running is representing Joseph Plum Martin, the great diarist from Connecticut. And you'll see objects in the case ahead that, again, relate to the American forces. And then as you go through the next door, you flee through New Jersey, for instance. You fight a few battles around New York. And I want to point out this tableau here, which is a great favorite of mine. This is, of course, the moment when the English immigrant and political writer Thomas Paine is writing his essay, The Crisis, which has those stirring words, "These are the times that try men's souls." And he wrote those words while marching with the army, retreating late November of 1776 through New Jersey. It was one of the lowest moments of the Revolutionary War. And there were a lot of low moments. But this tableau is based on an experience of the painter Charles Willson Peale, of course, originally from Maryland, but really associated with Philadelphia, and a great painter of portraits of George Washington, and his brother James Peale, who was fighting around New York with the Maryland troops that were with George Washington. And they were accidentally reunited on the banks of the Delaware River just across from Trenton as the last elements of Washington's army crossed the Delaware into Pennsylvania. This was headlong flight. The British were advancing. Congress was packing up to leave Philadelphia. Many people in New Jersey were starting to take loyalty oaths to the British, thinking that the game was up. And Charles Willson Peale, and he's the man in the uniform that's on the right, had come up with reinforcements from Philadelphia and is standing in the firelight next to a big campfire that was trying to warm these soldiers as they crossed the river and came up onto the high bank. And a man stumbled out of the darkness with a face that was covered in lacerations, and he had a beard that was kind of grown out, with a blanket that had been fashioned into a coat, shivering. And Charles Willson Peale did not recognize his own brother, James Peale. And so that's the scene that we wanted to capture here, as a kind of the type of scene that someone like Thomas Paine was seeing as he was writing those stirring words. Now, of course, this sets the stage for those 10 crucial days, for the way Washington miraculously is able to turn it around. So we've got an animated map on the right that you can push buttons and sort of see how the troop movements happen. The first crossing the Delaware, the Battle of Trenton, the retreat back to Pennsylvania, the second crossing of the Delaware, the second Battle of Trenton, the fighting at Princeton, et cetera. And so it's a great way to give some context to the fighting of 1776. So Meg, let's zoom through Gallery 10. I know I'm mindful of our time here. We have a great display there. We just passed through of the Oneida Indian Nation and its decision to side with the Continental Congress and the American cause during the Revolution. We have a great display of wonderful weapons, the type of arms that were used to secure American independence, an immersive battle theater that culminates in the Valley Forge winter. So you'll see a mural in the background kind of showing the training of the troops under the Baron von Steuben, some objects that belong to Washington, including a piece of his camp furniture there and some silver camp cups, as well as a tableau that represents the British occupation of Philadelphia. Many people come to Philadelphia and don't know that the British actually captured Independence Hall in Philadelphia and turned Independence Hall into a prison for captured officers. And so that's part of the story that you see represented in here. And let's head on into the ship gallery here. By now you see our third question, how revolutionary was the war? We've really start to expand the story, look at the global fighting that came about as France and then Spain joined the fighting against the British. You can actually, you'll see that represented on a map here as we kind of scroll around. So there's some of the global fighting. And then if we sort of keep scrolling around, you'll get a sense of the size, this privateer ship that we actually have built. And that is an education and programming space in the museum that you can bring school groups onto. You as visitors can interact with our interpreters and get a sense of what the war aboard a privateer ship during the Revolution might be like. And let's head for that scene off in the distance there with the ship sailing to Charleston if we can. Here we are now, the war turns to the south. So we're almost to the end of the trip here. This is a scene that you see this, we wanted to give people a little bit of a startled feeling. So as you walk in here and there's a soundscape that you're not hearing, which is the sound of a cavalry charge. And these two, of course, are loyalist troops under the famous Colonel Tarleton. These were the bad guys in Mel Gibson's movie, The Patriot. And so again, you get a sense of, oh gosh, what would it have been like to actually face mounted troops running us down in the 18th century. We explore the experience in the Deep South in Charleston, the fighting in the backcountry, the Battle of Cowpens, and we're on a sort of march toward Yorktown. And so go ahead, Meg, and take us to Finding Freedom. This is our third touchscreen interactive that we've looked at here. This is a tableau that explores the plight of enslaved people of African descent who had opportunities to make choices by either trying to run to the British to obtain freedom, as the British had promised, some of them serving in the Continental Army forces, or trying to sort of make a decision to just duck and survive the terrible violence swirling around them. Now, this is a touchscreen interactive in the museum, but is actually, we've launched this as a full-blown online experience. It's available for teachers. There's curriculum materials associated with it. And again, if you go to the website under our digital resources and look for Finding Freedom, you'll find this very, very engaging. And so this all culminates then in another one of those object theaters that brings the story to the end of the war. So this takes you through the Yorktown campaign and ultimately to the peace of 1783. And asks the question at the end, then what kind of nation did the revolution create? And this is our final gallery in the core experience here. We tell you the story of some of the people you've met along the way, people like Phyllis Wheatley and Daniel Shays and others. And then let's go into the Constitution. So of course, this is a period in which culminates in the writing and adoption of the Constitution, the ratification, the inauguration of George Washington. And that's a story that kind of spills out across the walls here in this final gallery. In this case, in the center, we have similar kinds of objects that we started with. So think about those household objects and public objects that had images of King George III. Now you're seeing a new George. This is, of course, President George Washington, and similar types of objects, trying to get our visitors to kind of think about that transformation that came about because of the Revolutionary War. And I'd love to go to the mirrors next, Meg, because this is one of the very affecting kind of final moments in the gallery. So as you exit this gallery, you've kind of come up to the early Republic, the kind of still within the lives of those founders. And on the left here, you will see a remarkable display. We've advanced you chronologically to the mid-19th century, let's say the 1840s, 1850s. And every single one of these photographs, there are 74 photographs at last count, is of a person who was alive during the Revolutionary War. Now, some of them were children. You see Isaac Granger, the African-American blacksmith on the left there, who was born enslaved at Monticello in 1776. But some of these were soldiers who crossed the Delaware with Washington or were at Valley Forge. They were Quaker women, maybe been young girls here in Philadelphia during the British occupation. So eyewitnesses to the founding of the nation. And what's remarkable about this last sequence here is we tell the story of how this was a moment of great immigration, great expansion of the diversity of people who were moving to the rapidly expanding United States. It was also a moment of real existential crisis that should sound familiar. People, as the living memory of this first greatest generation was passing, as they were passing out of life and into our memory, people were concerned that how will we continue this republic? Is the Declaration, does it apply to people who cannot trace their ancestry to these eyewitnesses of our founding generation? And as he often did, great clarity came from the words of Abraham Lincoln, who in his famous, during the Lincoln-Douglas debates, his famous electric cord speech, took up this question. It was a speech just after the 4th of July, and talked about how we gather during the 4th of July to feel connected to one another, to remind ourselves of our connection to these founders. But he says that only comprehends half of the nation. We were a nation of about 30 million at the time. These others are descendants of those who cannot look back and see a personal connection to that old declaration, as he calls it. But then Lincoln goes on to say that they look at that old declaration and they read those words, these are all men are created equal and endowed with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And they feel that that's the animating creed that's within them. That's why they, as great entrepreneurs, have come here to the United States. And that makes them flesh of the flesh and blood of the people who actually wrote those words in 1776. And so the final question that we sort of ask people is to look in these mirrors that Megil shows to the right, where we say to our visitors, meet the future of the American Revolution. And as we have begun over the last couple of years, for instance, to open the museum and offer free classes, for instance, to legal permanent residents, immigrants who want to take the naturalization test and become citizens, we use the museum as a classroom to teach. And we actually have graduates now who are new citizens who feel suddenly connected to this story in a very powerful way. And when we do those naturalization ceremonies, I always ask them to come down and stand with their families and take a photo looking at themselves in these mirrors. And that's really, as I started this talk by saying, that is such an important message for the Museum of the American Revolution. I just have one more picture to show you, and then I will hand the microphone back to Mary. But that is one of the great national treasures that we have the great, I think we have the great honor to be the custodians of. This is General George Washington's original sleeping in office tent. This was, I often call it the first Oval Office. This was his command headquarters. It was really the only private space that Washington had during those 8 long years of war that he was away from home and in the tented field. It's got an incredible story of how it passed down through descendants of Martha Washington and came to be in the possession of the founder of our organization, the Reverend Herbert Burke, back in 1909, actually arrived in Valley Forge on my birthday, August 19th in 1909. It's presented in a separate theater, and this is sort of showing you the culmination of that experience, but it's an incredibly powerful film that we did with Donna Lawrence from Louisville, Kentucky, and you just have to come here. I can't even describe to you the effect. I had some folks in the museum today, and I probably watch it 5 times a week at least, and still brings a tear to my eye and puts the hair on the back of my neck standing up to experience it. And so for those of you who have not visited, this alone is definitely worth the trip to Philadelphia. So I understand there might be a few moments for some questions, and I would be happy to talk as long as you can stand me. So, and how are we going to do that? Okay, Mary's coming back on. Excellent.
Thank you, Scott. We appreciate that very much. So if you have a question, we'll take a few questions. You can type them into the chat.
Yeah, sure.
And you'll be able to view them.
George Bray, my old friend who's known me since I was about 15. George, you had asked about the British officer in that first gallery. So that's Lieutenant John Ross of the 34th Regiment of Foot. He came to America for the siege of Havana in 1762. And then, I do not remember if he was in the 34th, that portrait, he's in the 34th Regiment. He was posted to the Mississippi Valley and actually spent the years just after the peace of 1763. He spent several years mapping the kind of middle Mississippi Valley and ultimately produced the first British, very accurate engraved map of the Mississippi Valley. Of course, new British territory. And what's wonderful about that portrait, it was painted just after he returned to England. I think it was about 1768 when he rotated home. And the portrait is absolutely commemorating his American service. On the wall behind him, there's a painting, a landscape painting that shows the junction of two rivers. I think it probably represents the Mississippi and the Ohio because he had been at that spot. He's in his accoutrements for field service. So he's armed. He has all of his signatures of rank there. He has a grenadier cap that he's reaching for. He has a cartridge box. And so this is a commemoration of active service in the 7 Years' War, and someone who then comes back and actually fights in the Revolutionary War based in Canada. So he served in the St. Lawrence Valley and in the Champlain Valley. So Fort Crown Point, Ticonderoga, that area. And that portrait is actually, I'm almost positive, is in the collection gallery that's on our website. So you can access an image of it and some more information about it if you go to the website. I think Meg's going to try to take us there while we're talking. And what I'm reading with my old eyes for any other questions. Great. Well, please do, if any of you make it here to Philadelphia, I hope you won't be strangers. Things are opening up again, and we are looking forward to a great summer ahead, as I know you are as well. I will certainly be at Fort Ligonier at some point in the next 3 or 4 months, and I look forward to stopping in and seeing all friends there. So thanks for spending the time with me. I know I probably rambled on a little long, so I hope I haven't derailed your evening plans, but thank you for the opportunity, and God bless.
Thank you, Dr. Stephenson. And thank you all for participating. We hope to see you all in person for our 2022 annual meeting. Thank you. Have a great night.